Welcome to the Sanctions Age, the podcast that explores how sanctions are changing the world. My name is Isvander Batmangelic. We talk a lot on this podcast about sanctions, how they're supposed to work, how they actually work, and what happens when they don't work as intended. Few tools in America's sanctions arsenal have been used as aggressively as oil sanctions. These measures are meant to hit oil-producing rogue states where it hurts, starving governments of vital revenues and forcing changes in policy. But look around the world today, and you will see a growing list of countries defying oil sanctions. Iran is still pumping, Russia is still exporting, Venezuela is still finding buyers. Oil sanctions were once thought to be the most powerful economic weapon in Washington's toolkit. My guest today believes that the age of oil sanctions as a coercive tool is coming to an end. Gregory Brew is an analyst with Eurasia Group's Energy, Climate, and Resources team. He also serves as the group's Iran country analyst. A historian by training, Greg is the author of 2 books on the politics of Iran's oil sector and U.S. foreign policy. In a recent article published in July, Greg argued that oil sanctions no longer work, at least not the way that Washington always assumed that they would. We're going to unpack Greg's argument and along the way look at how countries like Iran and Russia are still pumping, shipping, and marketing oil for eager buyers. We'll talk about the networks that move the sanctioned crude, the central role that China plays in these trades, and about a recent report into a shadowy broker called Ocean Glory that shows just how sophisticated sanctions evasion has become. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So let's start with the basics. Oil sanctions are obviously a cornerstone of American economic statecraft, but I think a lot of listeners might not realize how exactly the U.S. can exercise power to determine what countries are allowed to produce, distribute, and refine oil. Can you tell us a little bit about what the measures are that we're talking about when we speak about oil sanctions, and give us a run-through of what countries are currently subject to these kinds of sanctions?
Sure thing. Well, first, I think it's important to note the scale of the so-called sanctioned oil market as it exists today in 2025. The 3 major oil producers that are under heavy U.S. sanction are Iran, Venezuela, and Russia. Combined, they equal about 13 million barrels a day in production. That's about 12% of global production, so a pretty significant chunk. Even more significant, Russia, Venezuela, and Iran collectively hold nearly a third of the global proven oil reserves. In other words, reserves that are known to exist and are known to be commercially viable at relevant prices. So a third of the world's oil is under U.S. sanction in some way, shape, or form. So this is a significant portion of the global oil market. On the question of how these sanctions work, there's really 2 methods of sanction that are relevant. The first, what we see a lot these days, are primary sanctions. These are sanctions delivered by the United States via the Treasury Department and OFAC, the Sanctions Office, and they take specific aim at actors involved in producing, moving, accepting the oil, or managing the money involved in these transactions. So these are primary sanctions that target primary actors directly involved in the oil trade. To give you some examples, there was just a recent release of new OFAC sanctions this week that targeted a dozen tankers that are known to move Iranian crude, as well as a variety of intermediaries that handle the money involved in getting Iranian crude from Iran to China, Iran's main customer. But there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of sanctions listings at this point that target entities directly involved in the trade. So those are the primary sanctions, and they have become very relevant today. More importantly, however, in restricting the flow of the crude are secondary sanctions. And these are the sanctions that the U.S. usually threatens to impose, doesn't always or often impose, but threatens to impose on actors that do business with the producers of the sanctioned crude. So in other words, countries in the West or in the broader global economy who had previously purchased Venezuelan oil or Iranian oil before the imposition of sanctions, when those sanctions were imposed, the United States issued a direct threat that if they continued to buy the crude, then they themselves would come under sanction. So primary sanctions action and then secondary sanction threats are really the 2 ways that the United States, as well as other actors, the EU has also imposed oil sanctions, particularly on Russia. That's really the main avenues for sanctions action. And that's how the sanctions oil market has emerged over the last decade.
So we have these three major oil producers, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, that are subject to some combination of these primary and secondary sanctions. Over the course of the last couple of decades, there have been other smaller oil producers that have also had targeted kind of oil sanctions affecting their production and supply. But ultimately, you've decided, or you've sort of come to the assessment, which you set out in this foreign policy article published in July, that the age of oil sanctions as a coercive tool is coming to an end. And so I wonder how we sort of square that. I mean, you have this picture where at least at the level of reserves, a third of the world's oil is subject to some form of U.S. sanctions regime. But at the same time, you're telling us that actually these measures have probably stopped being effective. Why has that come about? And when do you think that they really stopped working?
So I think in order to frame this answer, I think we do need to clarify what we mean by working. What are the point of these sanctions? The sanctions, as I make very clear in the piece, the sanctions have had a significant, profound impact on the global oil market. They have radically redirected the flow of oil from sanctioned producers. They've created new markets. As you mentioned, there has been a recent FT piece, as well as lots of other publications on how these new sanctioned oil markets work, all the variety of shadowy intermediaries that are involved in moving, processing, selling the oil. So without a doubt, the sanctions have had an impact. My argument, however, is that they no longer work or appear to work as they were originally conceived. Sanctions action, as you well know, has been discussed on this podcast, the power of sanctions comes not only from imposing them, but offering to relieve them. In other words, sanctions relief comes in response to actions taken by the sanctioned target. You want Iran to make concessions on its nuclear program. You want Russia to reach a ceasefire in Ukraine. You want Venezuela to improve human rights or create more space for democracy. That's what the sanctions are meant to do. They're not simply meant to recreate, reshape markets. They're meant to deliver substantive change in the sanctioned target. And the conclusion that I reached some time ago, and that I made clear in the piece, was that we can think about oil sanctions as tools to shape markets, but thinking about them as tools to change state behavior, the evidence doesn't bear that out. The evidence and experience of the last decade plus makes it fairly clear that actors find ways around sanctions, that actors are fairly resilient to the economic pressure that sanctions creates. In some cases, sanctions create winners as well as losers. Particularly in the example of Iran that you are very familiar with, there are plenty of actors, outfits, and organizations that have profited from sanctions that may, to a certain degree, want sanctions to remain in place. So as a way of shaping state behavior, oil sanctions haven't delivered the goods. Realistically, I don't think it's likely that the United States stops using oil sanctions. There's a great deal of inertia built into U.S. sanctions policy. But I think when we think about sanctions in the context of the global oil market and in the context of international relations, imagining that they will change state behavior doesn't seem like a reasonable assessment, at least from where I'm sitting. As to where I reached this conclusion, I think it depends a little bit in each national context. In the context of Venezuela, I don't think oil sanctions ever really shifted the needle as far as adjusting the Maduro's government position on democracy inside the country. If anything, the imposition of U.S. sanctions made it somewhat easier for the government in Caracas to close ranks and to use increased U.S. pressure as a way of maintaining and solidifying its control. In the context of Iran, I mean, this is a more nuanced discussion. There is obviously a great deal of interest in obtaining sanctions relief inside Iran. But the key point that I would use is, I think, August to 2022, when Iran had an opportunity to return to the JCPOA and opted not to, at precisely the same time that Iranian oil exports to China were really starting to surge. In other words, oil sanctions on Iran really weren't working the way that they had, to some extent, between 2019 and 2021. And this likely played at least some role in the Iranian decision to forego a return to the JCPOA in 2022. And then on Russia, we have a slightly shorter window, we have a slightly shorter time since the sanctions there are only a few years old. But I think what we're clearly seeing in the current context, Putin resisting efforts to get a ceasefire in Ukraine, Trump threatening new oil sanctions, but in a sort of half-hearted way, I think it's fairly clear that the oil sanctions aren't really effective as a means of leverage to exert any influence over Russia's position on Ukraine, vis-a-vis or compared to other policy levers, such as increasing support for Ukraine or changing the calculus on the battlefield. The sanctions haven't delivered the goods in the way that I think some assumed that they would.
The question then becomes, why haven't the sanctions delivered the goods? I mean, historically, we do have a track record of oil sanctions being quite effective at putting economic pressure on targeted countries. But it looks like, in the last sort of 10 years, there has been this sort of sophisticated effort on the part of actors at different parts of the supply chain. And that's also something that I think we have to keep in mind, is that it's not enough just to produce the oil. You have to get the oil to market. And then ultimately, you need to have someone at the other end of that supply chain that's willing to buy the oil. And all along the supply chain, we seem to see a coordinated action to allow countries to try and resist that economic pressure. And what I want to do is kind of ask you to go through the different parts of this supply chain and sort of explain why, given this thesis that you have, that the coercive effect of these sanctions is really abating, how that's being borne out at these different levels. So maybe we can start with the producers. I mean, in theory, policymakers in the US or in Europe that are committed to oil sanctions would be imposing these measures in order to limit the ability of companies in the country that is being sanctioned to actually produce oil. So if you sanction those companies and you create sectoral sanctions, it's harder in theory for those companies to acquire the parts and equipment they need to keep the oil sort of flowing. We have seen that in Venezuela, oil output is down a fair bit, but in countries like Iran and Russia, oil production remains robust, even though these sanctions have been in place for a while now. How is it that producers in these sanctioned countries manage to adapt? And, what are the choices or the strategies that they're using to maintain oil production even when these sanctions measures are in place?
Well, I think thinking about them in the distinct national context is useful because, as analysts of the oil market or people who watch the oil industry know, every variety of crude is slightly different. Every national context is different. The geology is very often different. In the context of Venezuela, there was a deterioration in the national oil production, the national oil industry, before sanctions were imposed. There was a great degree of overproduction between 2008 and 2014. There was a fairly significant mismanagement of the national oil resources. Some of that comes down to the nature of the resources themselves. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, but it's a variety of crude that is very heavy, very sulfuric. It requires particular technical processes in the refining industry in order to turn into products that are useful. So Venezuela, and this is a problem that Venezuela has had going back decades, obtaining the necessary technical expertise, technical know-how to render the crude viable. In the period before 2014, this process was not being handled particularly well by the Venezuelan authorities, and at the same time, the fields themselves were being overproduced. When the price of oil crashed in 2014, there was a profound economic crisis within Venezuela, which further compounded the deterioration of the production base. And then U.S. sanctions were imposed, and Venezuela has struggled to resume any kind of significant production ever since. It still is producing, and it does find a market, particularly in China. And more recently, there has been a U.S. effort to restart the oil industry there, particularly through Chevron, a major U.S. oil company. The U.S. is also Venezuela's natural market in a way that is not true for Iran and Russia. So in that context, efforts to resist sanctions, the effect of sanctions on production, have been particularly difficult for Venezuela in a way that is not true for Iran and Russia. Like Venezuela, Iran and Russia have very large and very well-developed domestic oil industries. They have domestic expertise, geologic expertise, technical expertise that allow them to develop their oil resources in resistance to sanctions, where they can't get financial or technical know-how from international firms. But at the same time, the nature of their reserves make continuing production a little easier. Iran, in particular, has fairly large fields that are fairly easy to develop commercially. The geology is well understood. In some cases, there are fields that have been developed for nearly a century or over a century in some cases. In Russia, fields are more sophisticated, but they have been developed over the last 30 years. Russia has a pretty significant domestic industrial base to continue production, even in resistance to U.S. sanctions. So some of it comes down to the nature of the production base. Iran, I would say, is also devoting considerable national resources to continuing hydrocarbon production, to the detriment of other aspects of the national economy. Hydrocarbon production is a priority for the Islamic Republic. It's willing to put the money in to continue production. The same is true of Russia, but I would say to a somewhat lesser extent, given the relative size of the Russian economy. So some of this comes down to geology. Some of it comes down to the management of the national industry. But in all three cases, I would say there has been general success at continuing production and resistance to the sanctions. Where the sanctions, where evading and managing the sanctions becomes more complicated, as you note, is in the intermediary and final steps. Managing the flow of oil from the fields to a customer at the other end of the line.
So let's talk about that intermediation. I mean, basically, we can have a situation where in countries like Iran or Russia, the conditions are in place for a large domestic hydrocarbons industry to, through kind of the just sheer willpower, keep the oil coming out of the ground, even as the sanctions make life difficult for them in certain ways in terms of accessing technology or financial resources. And so once you have that production, how is it that a sanctioned producer like Russia or Iran or Venezuela is getting that oil to market? Because I think there's sort of two streams that we can think about here. You not only have to physically move the oil, which means you need some kind of logistics solution, oil tankers that are willing to carry this product. You also need to have a financial channel because you have to get paid for what you're selling. Those are two areas where sanctions can also be imposed. So we talked about, you mentioned the idea that there are tankers that are being individually sanctioned by the US. There are also banks that are being sanctioned. How is it that you have, despite these measures, these sanctions targeting banks and, let's say, logistics solutions providers, that it's still possible for a country like Iran or Russia to get their oil to market?
So the one thing, before tackling this question, I want to add one point that I don't think I made before, which is that while the producers are successful at maintaining production, all of them face declines without sanctions relief in some way, shape, or form. Both Iran and Russia, their capacity to produce is likely to decline slowly, but the decline is there, likely without some degree of sanctions relief. So while they are producing, it's on a downward trajectory. To the question of intermediaries, there has always been a shadowy hydrocarbon market going back decades. There have always been traders, intermediaries who have been willing to take oil, move it through less than legitimate channels, in some cases to get around sanctions, in other cases to move oil or oil products to actors that aren't regarded as legitimate, warlords, armed groups, civil war factions, this sort of thing. I mean, any organization that manages territory requires fuel in some way, shape, or form. In cases going back to the middle of the 20th century, they have obtained it through shadowy intermediaries. So there has always been a sanctioned oil market in some way. What's happened over the last decade is that it has exploded in size. I would say as a direct consequence of the expansion of the U.S. sanctions regime. Starting in 2020, the number of so-called shadow fleet tankers that are operated or owned by less than fully legitimate outfits that are willing to take sanctioned crude, that don't move through Western commercial channels, that don't use Western naval insurance, who turn off their AIS transponders to make it more difficult for them to be tracked. There have been a number of vessels that meet this description, the number has increased as the volume of sanctioned crude has grown, right? There was a pretty significant number of shadow fleet tankers moving Iranian and Venezuelan crude after February of 2022, the outbreak of war in Ukraine. In the course of 2022, as sanctions on Russia began to increase, the number of shadow fleet tankers increased. The reasons why come down to the nature of business. If there's an opportunity for profit to be made, people will get involved. As the business continues, as it expands, and as authorities fail to shut it down, then it becomes more attractive because the security becomes a little bit more understood. The ways of doing business become more entrenched. It is a difficult business since new sanctions are constantly being levied. But what we've seen over the last number of years is actors willing to take action in response to sanctions, right? Tankers will trade hands as soon as they are sanctioned. They'll move from one entity to another. Tankers will change their names. They'll move from different flags. One moment they'll be flagged under Panama. The next moment they'll be flagged under Hong Kong or somewhere else, so that they can continue operating in sanctioned oil channels. Financial intermediaries, I mean, in the digital age, you can create a bank in a matter of hours in a suitably accommodating jurisdiction. If your bank is sanctioned, then you close it down and then you open a new bank in a different jurisdiction under a different name, using different identification to continue the business which you were managing days before. So as the market continues, as it expands and as it becomes more understood by those participating in it, its ability to resist sanctions and manage the impact of sanctions becomes more entrenched and more managed. On the financial side, some of this has to do with the diversion of business away from the dollar. Oil has always been traded in dollars predominantly. It's sort of grounded in the history of the international oil industry going back to the 1940s and 50s. But more recently, an increasing amount of hydrocarbon business is managed outside of the dollar. It's managed in local currencies. It's managed in cryptocurrencies. It's managed in barter associations. It's managed through financial relations, such as what were being noted by the FT piece, this use of so-called naval mortgages. A financial term or a financial good that does exist, but is now being leveraged for a purpose that it was not originally intended to be used for. So, given how sophisticated international finance has become, and given how sophisticated the market for sanctioned crude has become, its ability to resist new sanctions has increased, which has only made the business that much more attractive.
There's this obviously incredible entrepreneurial energy that's being devoted to trying to figure out ways of circumventing sanctions. Of course, much to the dismay of the sanctioners in Washington, who end up having to play like this game of whack-a-mole with all these entities that are coming up. But at the end of the day, it would not be worthwhile to undertake all of this effort unless at the end of your supply chain, you had a very committed customer that is willing to continue to purchase the sanctioned oil. And in your foreign policy piece, you write and you observe actually that even during the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, oil customers in China were not discouraged from buying Iranian oil. And in fact, one of the things that we have seen consistently when it comes to Venezuela, Russia, and Iran is this really key role that China has played in that there seems to be a very clear commitment on the part of Chinese buyers to continue to buy oil that the U.S. is considering prohibited. What explains basically China's role here, their willingness to buy this oil and accept some degree of risk? And how exactly is it that they are purchasing this oil and processing this oil in refineries without exposing large parts of the Chinese economy to that secondary sanctions risk that you talked about at the top of the conversation?
Sure thing. So a quick point on the entrepreneurial spirit that you referenced. One crucial element that I think we do need to note is that oil has been and continues to be an excellent way to make money, given the disparity between the cost of production and the price that you can charge for the final refined product. The margins are very attractive. They've always been attractive, and they continue to be. That's what creates the space for this sanctioned trade. The other reason is that the actors involved who are producing the oil, particularly Iran and Venezuela, They need this trade. They need it to earn currency. They need it to keep their industries afloat. Shutting in oil production is expensive, and it is difficult to reverse. So once you stop using it, you lose it. So maintaining the pace of production is important, even if you're selling oil at a steep discount or even at a loss. That gets me to the second question. Why is China willing to take it? Well, first we need to clarify who in China is taking the crude. China has the second largest, perhaps even largest at this point, refining sector. It may still, in terms of absolute throughput, it may be still slightly smaller than the United States, but China's refining sector is colossal. It is also fairly diverse. There are the large state-supported or state-owned enterprises, Sinopec, CNCP, and others that control very large petrochemical and refining complexes that take huge amounts of crude oil. And then there are the smaller, independent, occasionally referred to as teapot refiners that used to have a much larger footprint in the Chinese refining sector. They're being squeezed. They're predominantly located in the Shandong province in eastern China. And they tend to run smaller outfits. They tend to take less crude per company. But they unlike the larger firms that develop refined products very often for export or to service markets outside of China, the independent refiners service the domestic Chinese market. In other words, they don't care about the dollar. They don't care about Western banks. They don't care about how their business is going to be perceived in New York or DC or London. They're interested in getting cheap crude, churning out products that they can then sell to their customers within China. That sort of forms the core of why they're willing to participate in the sanctioned crude market. If Iran or Russia sells or offers crude oil at a discount, which they do, they offer it at a discount below Brent, the primary price index. This discount varies. Sometimes it's as small as $1 per barrel. At other times, it's been as much as $10 per barrel under Brent. Given that these independent refiners can obtain the crude at a discount, it makes it commercially attractive. In the case of Iran specifically, this is a captive source of supply. I've been told by those involved that in many cases, the Chinese refiners are very stubborn when it comes to driving bargains with the Iranians because they know the Iranians can't go anywhere else. They know they don't have any other customers. So given that this is a captive source of supply, it makes it even more attractive because they can get it on attractive terms and they can get it consistently. The final element I'd say is Beijing's attitude towards this trade is fairly hands-off. It doesn't do a huge amount to facilitate the trade, but it doesn't do much to get in its way. I think for the Chinese government, this is an effective means of providing support to allies or partners like Iran, Russia, and to a lesser extent, Venezuela. It is a captive source of supply. They know that these producers can't go many other places. Russia is a slightly different example, given how the sanctions work in this context. But if state authorities aren't willing to get in the way, and if the crude is obtainable on commercial terms that are attractive, and if the sanctions themselves don't really threaten the core business at stake, then that makes it attractive for customers in China. The final point I'll make, getting back to whether or not these sanctions quote unquote work, is that they do work in the sense that no one else is touching the oil, right? There are customers, I'll go back to Iran because it's the example I know best. There are customers for Iranian crude in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, who would like to take it, but who don't, because they don't want to be sanctioned by the United States. So in that sense, the sanctions still are effective as they were originally conceived at limiting the ability to sell this crude. But because you have the China channel, because you have the customers in China who are willing to buck the sanctions, to challenge the sanctions, and because they get a degree of support from the government in Beijing, ultimately the sanctions are ineffective. And again, the size of the Chinese market works. If it was a smaller actor with a smaller refining base and a smaller domestic market, then it wouldn't be as big of an issue.
That idea that China is this buyer of last resort, I think, is a really important feature of what's happening here. But we've mentioned a few times this Financial Times investigation. And I want to turn to that now, because what I think it does is it kind of suggests that we're entering into a slightly new phase when it comes to this effort on the part of sanctioned oil-producing countries to try and circumvent the pressure of the U.S. sanctions. And the Financial Times investigation basically focused on a broker called Ocean Glory. And as you alluded to earlier, they had used a financial instrument called naval mortgages as a way to get the financing necessary to export oil to China. But what was striking is that they weren't just using this scheme for the benefit of exporting oil from one country. Rather, as the Financial Times investigation revealed, they were able to raise enough financing to move around 130 million barrels of oil worth nearly $10 billion. And that oil originated half of it from Iran, around a quarter from Russia, and around the same amount from Venezuela. And almost all of that oil ended up being sold to China. So when you look at that and you identify that there are brokers that are working across all three of these geographies that we've talked about with different oil sectors, different contexts, we've talked about why these are actually different cases. What's the significance of having players like this emerge? And what does it mean sort of for the outlook for oil sanctions if we're not just dealing with these sort of individual parallel efforts to circumvent, but actually something that's starting to function more like a coordinated market or a coordinated set of actors and institutions?
Well, I think it supports the view that the size of the sanctions regime and the way that it's now encompassing multiple oil producers and large reserve holders ultimately undermines the goals of the sanctions policies in the specific national contexts. In other words, by imposing so many sanctions on a variety of different countries for slightly different goals, the United States has effectively created a new oil market that it cannot control or significantly influence. If there are now actors, and there have been actors for a while, I'd say, who are willing to operate in both the Russian, Iranian, and again, to a lesser extent, the Venezuelan context, who have proven adept at managing all three oil industries, managing the movement of oil from all three producing bases, getting around different sanctions in each national context, all to serve essentially the same set of consumers, that would suggest that any move by the United States to strengthen or adjust sanctions policy in one country will simply shift the business to another, right? So you haven't actually ended up accomplishing anything of significance. If there's now this integrated global sanctioned market, which there is, it's existed now for at least several years. It's being explicated and revealed through this reporting, but it's something that oil analysts have been aware of for quite some time. So if the United States, and I think you're also seeing it play out to a certain degree in how the U.S. is kind of thinking and handling its oil sanctions policy. I think there is now something of a tacit acknowledgement that the U.S. can't stop the flow solely through sanctions, that by sanctioning one node, it shifts business to another, that avoiding sanctioning Russia while sanctioning Iran makes these actors or agents more interested in taking Russian crude, and that over time, Iran, by becoming perhaps more discounted, more attractive, shifts the business back. So the size of the sanctions regime makes it less effective to actually sanction the actors involved. I don't know how the U.S. can address this other than to completely drop the sanctions and to try something new. I think it was an element of my article, this idea that acknowledging that the sanctions may not change state behavior or state policy. At the same time, I think it behooves us to acknowledge the fact that it has had an impact on the market. It has created a new market that is going to continue existing, since it's not realistic to imagine the U.S. dropping the sanctions unilaterally.
I want to shift a little bit and to actually look at some of the choices that are in front of the U.S. And you've touched on the fact that the Russia sanctions program is different when it comes to oil than, let's say, the Iran or even Venezuela sanctions programs because it has a different mechanism in place. And that is that there is a price cap that is sort of been imposed by the US and Europe with regards to Russian oil. So in theory, a broader set of countries can continue to purchase Russian crude, but they can only do so at a certain price. And that is an effort to try and limit the amount of money, basically, that the Russians are making from this trade. You mentioned in the foreign policy piece that targeting Russian revenue didn't work as hoped, I think alluding to this price cap approach. What was the thinking behind the price cap, and did the recourse to the price cap rather than kind of the full blocking sanctions that we saw with regards to Iran's oil industry, was that an early indication that Western policymakers were starting to realize that actually the oil sanctions had they been imposed in a more stringent way, probably wouldn't have worked and would have had counterproductive effects?
Right. So the development of the price cap is actually illustrative of an element of oil sanctions policy. I mean, any policy comes with risk or cost, but with oil sanctions, the cost, at least for the United States, is fairly clear. If you sanction an oil producer with the intent of driving down its production of oil, as with the case of Iran and Venezuela, there will be a market reaction. You are placing upward pressure on the price of oil. That's an economic factor for the United States. It's also a political factor, given the salience of gasoline prices in the United States. It's a constant source of political interest. In the case of Iran in 2019, there was a willingness to completely drive Iranian crude from the market. There was an acknowledgement that there was sufficient spare capacity that if Iran was, quote unquote, driven to zero, then there would be a price impact, but that eventually it would be absorbed, which was in fact the case. There are other nuances that we could go into, but for all intents and purposes, the policy worked, at least initially, without a significant price impact. With Venezuela was largely dependent on access to the U.S. market, and the sanctions there were also effective at pushing it out without significantly affecting the price of oil within the U.S. Russia posed a much larger issue. Russia produces 10 million barrels a day, or at least did in 2022. It produces slightly less now. 4.5 million barrels of crude, 3 million barrels of refined products. So this was a colossal amount of oil. Had the United States and other actors moved to an Iran policy of driving Russia to zero, the impact on the global oil market and the price of oil and the price of gasoline in the United States would have been considerably more than was already the case in 2022. If we can all remember, the price of oil shot up to over $100 a barrel that year. The purpose of the price cap was to target Russian finances, not Russian production. It used Russian access to Western insurance companies as a means of forcing Russia to sell significantly lower than the market price. The market price of 2022 was, as I mentioned, over $100 a barrel. Price cap was meant to force Russia to sell at $60 a barrel. The way that Russia was able to get around the price cap in some aspects was by using this shadow fleet tanker system that I mentioned. In many cases, the Russian crude is still being sold at a discount below Brent, but it's not moving within the system of the price cap as the G7, as the United States originally conceived. The larger point, however, that I make is the idea that squeezing Russian finances in this way would change its policy regarding the war in Ukraine. It simply hasn't happened. It hasn't caused the Russian economy to collapse. It hasn't caused Russian finances to deteriorate to a level that would prove decisive in changing Russian policy. I think Russia has surprised most analysts by proving to be quite resilient, both in the production of oil and oil products, but also in its overall economic picture. But the way the price cap was conceived, the way it was rolled out, and the way it was managed speaks to an inherent limitation in sanctions policy. This sensitivity, particularly in the United States, to taking any action that could have upward price pressure on the price of oil and the price of gasoline.
I'm curious whether there's also a sensitivity on the other side of the spectrum, because, of course, if you try and limit the supply too much and the price of oil goes too high, and the knock-on effects for the price at the pump and U.S. consumers getting very antsy about that, that is an obvious limitation. But at the same time, it seems like we have a situation today where, as we've talked about, there's a new market for sanctioned oil that sits alongside the legitimate market. It's actually a very large market. It is connected to the largest consumer of oil in the world, at least imported oil. And that, because the sanctioned oil tends to be sold at a discount, it seems to me that the fact that that market exists provides a kind of downward pressure on the oil price that actually you have a lot of oil that is being sold probably at a lower price than it otherwise would be. And in a sense, this reduces the demand for the oil at the higher price. And I'm curious what that means for US producers, because in the scheme of all of this, and this was not really the case, let's say 20 or 30 years ago when the US started to develop this tool of oil sanctions. Today, the US is itself a major oil producer, not a major exporter, but nonetheless, it is part of this global oil market, not just as a consumer, but also as part of the countries that are contributing to supply in a big way. You have in the US a lot of oil producers that extract oil that's pretty expensive to extract. Here I'm thinking about the sort of shale oil producers. What does it mean for the US to be in a world where it has its own production base it has to care about? And does that mean that there's also a limit to how far they can take a measure like the price cap? Or alternatively to that, is there a limit to a different strategy to trying to put pressure on sanctioned countries that are oil producers, which is to flood the market with supply so that you drop the price and therefore kind of deprive revenues that way? Because that seems to me like something that could have been done with regards to Russia in particular. You want to avoid the political pain of high gas prices. Well, why don't you do the opposite? Just really bring that price down to put pressure on the Russian state finances.
It is a situation that lends itself to creative thinking, given the liquid nature of the global oil market, and given precisely the contradictions or discrepancies that you lay out. Right, when you reduce supply, you increase price, you increase the revenue that is obtainable from marketing oil. For a sanctioned producer, cutting its production but increasing the price at which it can sell, it actually could benefit the producer, given the fact that oil is a wasting asset. It's a finite resource. You want to sell less for more. You don't want to drain your reserves, especially if you're under sanction. So that is a one aspect of policy. The difficulty for the United States that speaks to what you laid out. The U.S. is a major producer and a major exporter. The U.S. exports between 3.5 and 4 million barrels of crude oil a day. The issue for the United States that is maybe not the issue for Iran or for Russia is that the U.S. has an entirely private oil industry. There's no central energy ministry. There's really no federal lever to use to manage oil policy beyond something like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which the Biden administration used quite creatively in 2022 to influence the global oil market. U.S. oil producers do have to operate on the benefit of profit and loss. They do have to operate on the basis of balancing anticipated changes in price with their planned capital expenditure schedules. And they can't produce or profit at lower prices. And we're actually seeing that play out right now. The price has fallen relative to what it was last year and earlier this year. And U.S. shale sector is pulling back a little bit in response to that price pressure. It doesn't really work in the context of U.S. sanctions policy to have your own production being reined in while you're trying to limit the production of your rivals. I would note, however, that over the sort of 10 years or so before COVID in 2020, the U.S. was able to dramatically expand crude oil production, in part because sanctions were biting into the production of producers like Iran and Venezuela by leaving a gap in the market that the U.S. could fill. OPEC as well. OPEC decided to undertake production cuts in an attempt to manage the price, and this created even more space for the U.S. to seize market share. The way I think about it, it's more an aspect of the commercial logic of the international oil industry and less an aspect of oil sanctions policy for the United States. In the way to think about it is that the right hand of the U.S. federal government may not know what the left hand of the U.S. oil industry is doing, and they may not be working in tandem or in concert, given that the interests of the U.S. government, the interest of the U.S. national security state, is distinct from the interests of private U.S. oil companies. This is, and incidentally, as a historian, this is something that I've always liked to tease out. It's like there's this idea that there is a confluence of interests and a confluence of perspective between the private U.S. oil industry and the U.S. state, and that isn't always the case. In fact, I would argue that it's often not the case, that if companies don't see a profit to be made, then they won't make it, even if that jibes with U.S. policy perspectives, U.S. policy goals.
A reasonable kind of assumption for a lot of outside observers to make when you had someone like Rex Tillerson, as Secretary of State coming out of ExxonMobil, sending certain messages. But I mean, I certainly take your point that at the end of the day, given the way that the energy sector is regulated and governed and the way that the markets work in the US, there isn't that degree of coordination that ironically you see in the sanctioned countries where you have large state oil companies that are acting kind of hand in glove with the governments.
When Rex Tillerson was CEO of ExxonMobil, the one country that he spent the most time, the most energy, and ultimately a lot of money on developing was Russia. And, look how that turned out.
Well, I did read somewhere that I think ExxonMobil might be trying to angle to get their Sakhalin oil fields back or something like that. So, the history is long when it comes to the oil sector, and you always try and stay in the game.
Never say never.
Greg, I mean, I am reasonably convinced by your sort of thesis that, the age of oil sanctions as a coercive tool has come to an end. But if that is a thesis that is, in fact, being borne out, and you've sort of alluded to this a little bit, that, there are some real dilemmas for U.S. policymakers. But, I mean, what are U.S. policymakers meant to do? This was the key kind of tool in the sanctions toolkit, largely because for various reasons, and this is maybe something that historians should look into, it so happened that the adversaries of the US tended to be large oil producers, and that was a pattern that recurred. And now you can't use, or you maybe have questions about the efficacy of this tool in trying to change the calculation for countries like Russia, Iran, Venezuela. Are there any smarter options that immediately come to mind for you, or are you mainly just identifying that this is a problem and hoping that some of the folks at Treasury and State might figure out something to do about this?
Well, I think it does get to the goals of the policy, which I think or the policies specifically, which I think mismatched the sanctions as tools. So in the context of Russia, sanctions on Russian oil exports, Russian finances, as a way of pressuring Russia to come to the negotiating table for a ceasefire in Ukraine. To me, the transfer there was never clear. It was never clear that Putin would prove convincible or prove pliable to that kind of economic pressure. That's not to say that the sanctions were ultimately a mistake. Sanctions, any policy is the product of a political environment. And the political environment of 2022 and 2023 was you had to increase economic pressure on Russia to respond to the war in Ukraine. So I understand the impulse. In the case of Iran, I think there actually was an argument to be made for a long time that sanctions were working in the sense that they were creating some space for diplomacy. But as we've seen over the last 6 months, diplomacy is also a function of what's acceptable for both parties. And the United States has had difficulty this year finding a point on which it could agree with Iran and create space for a suitable deal to bring.
That's an understatement.
I know. I'm dancing around it.
Well,
I have a little bit more to say about it at the end of our discussion. So in what the oil sanctions were meant to produce as a policy outcome, I think mismatched the extent or the practical extent of what the sanctions could do materially. So what the U.S. can do moving forward, I think it can understand those limitations. And it can understand that if new adversaries emerge that also happen to be major oil exporters and major oil producers, the U.S. should understand, OFAC, Treasury should understand, that simply slapping sanctions, even secondary sanctions, on the oil exports of the specific country, they're not going to produce the kind of impact that they maybe would have produced 20 to 30 years ago. They're not going to push the producer completely off the oil market. They're not going to produce the financial shock that is expected or anticipated or hoped for. And if the sanctions are going to push them into the sanctioned oil market, which, as I mentioned, is now large, considerable, complex, and likely here to stay. So I don't think unilaterally dropping oil sanctions is really on the table. But I think moving forward, the U.S. can understand the limitations of oil sanctions as a policy tool and look elsewhere for tools of economic statecraft. And I make the point in the piece that this could be useful in the context of China, that there has been talk of sanctioning China. There has been talk of using OFAC listing against Chinese actors. To a certain extent, it's being used in the context of Iranian oil. There have been some Chinese entities that have been sanctioned in a connection to taking Iranian oil, but there has been a more widely ranged discussion about sanctioning much larger Chinese entities. And I don't think that would produce positive policy outcomes. And I don't think that would be a positive policy direction for the United States to take. There are other tools of statecraft, economic statecraft, that are less likely to produce negative outcomes and more likely to align with U.S. national interests. That also ultimately comes down to whether or not the United States wants to pursue a decoupling with China or whether it wants to manage its relationship with China in a more amenable way. But bottom line, the kinds of sanctions that were or have been used against Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, I don't think are applicable to the context of China or even other oil exporters, given what we've learned, given what we've seen over the last several years.
Greg, we've reached the end of our time, which means I have to ask you the question I ask every guest on the show. When did you realize that sanctions are changing the world?
Well, I realized that oil sanctions weren't working. The real moment that I came to that conclusion was in June, when Israel attacked Iran. When war broke out and Israel, and then the United States bombed Iran, and the oil kept flowing. To me, that was a fairly clear acknowledgement that this idea that oil sanctions would compel changes in state behavior was proven to be a failure, because the U.S. was using military force rather than economic pressure in the context of changing Iran and addressing the nuclear issue. That it was abundantly clear that sanctions were no longer effective.
Especially because they had been kind of put forward as this alternative to military engagement. And here we were, and you had the oil sanctions in place, and yet there was still a military intervention.
And it was an argument that had been made for a long time, which was that adding more sanctions, increasing pressure without making, changes on the diplomatic side, without taking constructive diplomatic action, wasn't going to deliver a solution. It was simply going to narrow the aperture and increase the odds of military escalation. And that is, in fact, what took place.
Greg, I think that we should probably have a version of this conversation like 10 years from now and sort of see where we've ended up in the wild world of oil sanctions and all the circumvention. But thank you for taking the time for what has been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm Esfander Batmanghelidj, and this has been The Sanctions Age. Our show is produced by Spiritland Productions. Thanks for listening.